So you guys may have heard that Joe Rogan has officially signed an exclusivity contract with Spotify, and he will be moving over exclusively to Spotify by September 1st, and then everything will be moved over by the end of the year. This is a deal which is reportedly worth well over $100 million, so a massive buy-up for Spotify, and it's a really, really big deal, especially just considering, Joe Rogan's podcast is basically the biggest podcast out there overall. You look at his numbers on YouTube, you look at his numbers on Apple Podcasts, you look at his numbers basically everywhere. His numbers are insane. And so to have an exclusivity contract like that for Spotify is really crazy, really, really insane. Spotify has been trying to make a number of significant inroads when it comes to the podcast community. When a lot of people were trying to move to video and focus on video, Spotify was saying, look, we're going to focus in on audio. That's the thing that other, people were just like, oh, video, video, video. Spotify was like, you know what? No, we're going to put our eggs in one basket, and that basket's going to be audio, which surprised a lot of people. A lot of people were betting against Spotify, but it seems to have paid off. Now, one of the interesting things when it comes to that and when it comes to this specific contract is that Joe Rogan is saying that there will be the video versions of the podcast that will be up on Spotify. We have seen over the past, I'd say, year and a half, Spotify has been moving in slowly into video, and we're going to have to see if that's a long-term trend or if that's just something Spotify is sort of experimenting with. Obviously, though, when it comes to this Joe Rogan thing saying that they're going to be putting the video version of the podcast, the full video version of the podcast up on Spotify, it suggests to me, especially how much they just paid for the thing, that, this is going to be a long-term thing and that Spotify will be improving their video interface. This is a really big deal for independent media in general because we've been having a lot, sort of a bigger debate, I'd say, both on the left and the right, when it comes to independent media and when it comes to YouTube. Some people saying that YouTube constantly deprioritizes, demonetizes a ton of people, and so, you don't really get any kind of money. Now, what's interesting when it comes to Spotify is that the reason why Joe Rogan wasn't even on Spotify at all previously is because he said that Spotify didn't pay enough. So we're going to have to see how Spotify actually engages with that when it comes to courting over independent media, because Spotify has actually struggled a lot when it comes to growing in independent media, again, because they just don't pay individuals enough to put up their stuff. Songs and musicians, oftentimes end up needing to get, multi-million-dollar deals, licensing deals, et cetera, and they don't have a really good, sort of algorithm for discoverability. One of the benefits of YouTube is that it actually does have a really good algorithm for discoverability, and so, if you put out good content for a long period of time and you're consistent, there's a good chance that the algorithm will find you as long as you're sufficiently advertiser friendly, which is one of the criticisms that a lot of people have been making of YouTube more recently. We're going to have to see how Spotify engages with that, because Spotify does have a significant portion of their user base who does have a premium subscription so that they can avoid ads. And so it's possible that in the long run, Spotify could be a place for independent media to move on to. We have seen a number of, political podcasters, political commentators moving on to Spotify, alongside with YouTube and other, and other systems. So anyway, my point is this: we're going to have to follow, we're going to have to see whether or not this kind of long-term investment in independent media, into the Joe Rogan podcast means that we're going to be seeing kind of digital and technological innovations as well on Spotify, making it a more friendly platform for independent media in the long run. So I do think that, this Joe Rogan thing is definitely super, super interesting. And in terms of the Joe Rogan podcast, it's, Joe Rogan has been very, very clear that he is not going to be an employee of Spotify. He said, absolutely not. I wouldn't sign a deal like that. It's an exclusivity licensing contract, which means the show itself isn't changing at all. The exact same show is going to be, it's going to be the Joe Rogan show, except for now it's only going to be found on Spotify, the full version of the clips, the full version of the video. But he has said that he is going to be continuing to upload clips onto YouTube, which is one of the main concerns that I had, when I first sort of read the headline to this story, which I was sort of like, well, that's a good move for Spotify, but what about for the Joe Rogan podcast? How is he going to be able to continue growing? Because, it's going to be harder to get new people to, sort of find the podcast and move into the space. But if he does have the clips going up on YouTube, that, sort of segments of the show up on YouTube, people very likely might find the various clips and enjoy the clips and then be like, you know what, I want to find the full thing. And then there'll probably be like a link or something like that in the description to the Spotify. And then boom, you've got people moving on to the Spotify thing. So I don't think that it's really going to affect the sort of value of the show itself. The show, it sounds like it's going to be, again, exactly the same, and that, aren't Spotify is going to have zero creative control when it comes to the podcast. It's just an issue of going onto Spotify exclusively. So it's an interesting move, and I do think that it has a little bit more broader ramifications when it comes to independent media. Again, because a lot of people are sort of looking at moving off of YouTube. Now we have seen a interesting, sort of mix of different responses here. The Wall Street Journal just sort of talked about the business side of things. Business Insider had an interesting, sort of just broad take about what this means going forward and how Spotify is going up against Apple and Google and doing something like this. Now the New York Times got a lot of criticism for running this article about the story, because basically they sort of talked about it at the beginning, and then they spent the rest of the article basically attacking Joe Rogan for his comments in the past, and his and they minorly criticized him for endorsing Bernie Sanders. And so it was a bit of a weird read from the New York Times, and there was a lot of criticism. I saw people kind of attacking the New York Times for putting up this article. So it is interesting how, Joe Rogan, having sort of dipped his toes into politics last time around, this previous sort of primary cycle with the Bernie Sanders semi-endorsement, really, did lead to a situation where he got a lot of criticism, a lot of criticism, and I don't think that kind of criticism that we saw in the New York Times and a few other sites as well, running criticisms of Joe Rogan and slightly even criticizing Spotify for acquiring Joe Rogan. I don't think that we would have seen those kinds of criticisms had Joe Rogan not really stepped into politics. So it's an interesting and I think sad situation where Joe Rogan. It leads to a kind of censoring, right? Not for Joe Rogan, right? Joe Rogan has said, look, I'm not changing, whatever, say what you want about me. But for some people, you could imagine that kind of pressure, that kind of, people criticizing you and people possibly even making it less likely that he could get deals like that from, companies like Spotify, had the criticism been, a little bit more intense, I think does lead to people sort of censoring themselves. And that's not something that I'm a huge fan of. I'm pretty big on the whole free speech thing. I think that's the right way to go. Personally, I think that's the way to go. Obviously there's limits, and you got to be prudent about it and stuff like that. But anyway, I just wanted to sort of give you guys my take on this whole thing, tell you guys what I think about it. So you can let me know what you think about this down in the description. Are you still going to be watching the Joe Rogan stuff on Spotify? But anyway, for now, if you did like this video, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.